I still remember the sound of the laughter, that bitter, cutting kind that doesn't echo through a home but through a person's soul. My daughter-in-law stood by the kitchen counter, her arms folded, a smirk resting where compassion should have been, as she waved my crumpled first paycheck in the air like a piece of trash rather than proof that a 65-year-old widow could still fight her way back to dignity. "You bought groceries, not dreams," she said, her words slicing into me sharper than the cold December wind clawing through the windows of our worn-down farmhouse. She didn't understand that the scent of bread baking in that oven, the clinking of coins saved in an old coffee jar, and a receipt with my shaky signature were pieces of a dream I'd buried long before she even entered our lives. I had once known love that could make a girl believe the stars bent to her heart's wish, a love that vanished the day my husband's uniform came home folded, pressed, and lifeless. The war had taken him on a Tuesday, and I learned that grief has a sound, a door closing for the last time, with no promise of return. After him came years of silence, then a baby boy whose cries filled the hollow inside me, my only reason to breathe. I scrubbed floors, stitched clothes, and sold pies at the church steps just to buy him pencils for school, watching each small achievement of his become my victory. And when that boy grew, so proud and tall, I dared to dream again that maybe life would finally be kinder. But dreams cost money and survival demanded patience, so I gave the best I could. And when my hand shook too much to sew anymore, I learned something new. Computers at the library, typing resumes for strangers while the younger women whispered that I would be better off knitting. Yet I kept showing up every morning, one gray hair at a time, one cracked fingertip gripping hope that maybe, one day, I'd earn enough to feel useful again. That first paycheck, small, faded, wrinkled, wasn't currency, it was resurrection. It bought flour, potatoes, a bit of meat, and dignity enough to remind me that I still belonged somewhere in this world. But when she mocked me, calling it pathetic, laughter spilling out like venom, I saw not just her, but the ghosts of every person who ever told me I was too old, too poor, too broken to matter. I smiled that day not out of weakness, but because I learned long ago that revenge doesn't need noise, it needs time. So while she snickered and my son looked away, I made a silent promise to the woman in the cracked mirror. One day, she would understand that dreams aren't bought in malls or written on paychecks, but built in the quiet between humiliation and grace. That night, as the house slept, I sat by the window with the moonlight on my wrinkled hands, whispering to my husband's photograph that the war had returned. Only this time the battlefield was my own home, and I wasn't going to lose again. Long before dawn cracked the frozen silence, I sat in the brittle dark, listening to the familiar creaks of a house that mourned its own history, each floorboard resisting change, just like I had for so many years. While my son snored softly in the next room, comforted by a world he'd inherited rather than built, and my daughter-in-law slept with her dreams uninterrupted by regret, I stitched together resolve from torn fragments of memory and pride, the kind of resolve that soldiers find in letters from home and mothers find in the echo of empty cradles. The humiliation from that day pulsed in my veins like cold blood, but it didn't break me. Instead, it became the first brick in a wall only I knew how to build, a wall sturdy enough to hold all the pain and sacrifice the world had ever forced on women like me. It was then, while the rest of the world slept, that I decided the battle for respect in my own home would be fought quietly, for there's a kind of warfare in every family, long histories of wounds that never heal, but teach you where not to tread. I started small, waking before anyone else to sweep the porch, clearing the frost so no one would slip, arranging his work shirts so the collar stood proud, always careful not to erase any trace of myself in the process. I learned to bake bread softer than the sorrow that filled each sunrise, layering stories and tears into the dough, pressing secrets into each crust, proof that love and survival are as much ingredients as yeast or flour. I stretched my paycheck further than physics intended, bargaining at the market with a voice that trembled but never broke, carrying home bones for stock that would feed 3 mouths with flavor enough to taste my history. With every chore, every silent service, revenge braided itself into the pattern of my days, not the cruel kind, but the kind that grows stronger the more people overlook it. I planted daffodils behind the garage, knowing she'd walk past them every spring, blind to beauty rooted in sacrifice. And I taught myself how to use the internet late at night, scrolling past faces younger, luckier, yet none so determined as mine. Each family gathering, I sharpened my stories into lessons, gentle, wise, sometimes melancholic, never pointing out her cruelty, always letting pity for herself settle where anger might have flourished. I made tea when she had headaches, never once letting her hear about the bills I'd paid with coins snatched from the jaws of despair. Every kindness I offered was a calculated act, a way to carve out respect from the bedrock of disregard. On Sundays, when she arrived home with the scent of perfume purchased on someone else's dreams, I sat in my rocking chair, knitting scars into comforters my grandchildren would wrap around their sleeping forms, my voice gentle as the wind, never scolding, only reminding them that love, real love, is measured not in luxury, but in the weight of sacrifice. And late at night, while mocking laughter rattled in my weary chest, I wrote journals in secret, weaving together each cruel joke, each act of contempt, so that someday when history called my name, my story would outlive her ridicule and teach others that dignity sometimes grows best in the soil of offense. In those quiet hours, revenge felt like a prayer I whispered to my husband's memory, asking that the next day bring not retribution, but wisdom, the kind only survivors understand when dreams are bought with blood and groceries. Is Dane for these choices, her eyes cold with the weight of unmet expectations, and though her insults grew quieter, they never went away. They changed shape, became sighs and snide remarks, the sort that left bruises you couldn't show, only feel. But I learned to armor myself with memory, drawing courage from the raw days after my husband's death, remembering how I'd once survived loss that threatened to unravel who I was long before a paycheck or a cruel word from a pretty girl with hard hands could define me. I clung to my journals, filling pages late into the night with reflections and recipes, fragments of lullabies lost to time, and promises to my younger self that I'd find golden mornings, even when the world offered only dust. The town itself seemed to know my history, the librarian nodding with gentle solidarity, the postman lingering a moment longer to ask after my garden, even the old veterans tipping their hats, as if to say, "We know what it is to survive ridicule with dignity." With each passing year, I realized revenge was less about retribution and more about becoming unbreakable, a quiet defiance, a refusal to let cruelty shape the legacy I'd leave behind. Sometimes, in the secret places of my heart, I'd imagine running away, starting over in a distant town where no one could diminish what little I made of hope. But then I'd tuck those wild wishes beneath my pillow and rise again to face the sharp edges of her disappointment. Through it all, my gratitude grew fierce, an untamable wildfire. Now that I had weathered wars both abroad and at the dinner table, and I was still here, still giving, still unbroken, my love measured not by what was spent, but by what was survived, and by the dreams I quietly sowed among the groceries. The years turned heavier with silence stitched between us like invisible threads, my daughter-in-law's disdain simmering beneath polite smiles, her every glance a reminder that the battles we fought were no longer on distant fields, but entrenched within these walls where love had once flourished and nearly died. I watched my son transform under the weight of middle age and quiet regret, his eyes clouded with the burden of choosing between loyalty to the wife who mocked my efforts and respect for the mother who had carried him through storms that no paycheck could ever erase. I took to walking the miles through frostbitten streets at dawn, breathing in the promise of cold air sharp with snow, feeling the ache in my bones echo the years of labor and loss, but also the stubborn fire that refused to fade within me. I remembered how it felt to hold grief, so close that it became a part of your skin, a sorrow deeper than any river valley, and I wore it proudly, a badge of survival no smile could tarnish. At the church basement, I volunteered, serving meals to strangers whose stories mingled with mine in hushed rhythms of resilience. Those shared moments wove us into a fragile sisterhood of pain and hope, and I let those whispered confessions heal the cracks she tried to widen with her careless words. Back home, I found solace in letters to my late husband, believing he heard me in the quiet hours, sharing every insult disguised as jest, every triumph purchased with sweat and patched over tears. With each letter, I carved a narrative stronger than mockery, a testament to the legacy I intended to leave, one not measured by laughter at a paycheck, but by the dignity that paycheck represented, a legacy of battling storms, nurturing a family, and refusing to accept defeat in a war fought one day at a time. I saw the children grow, their eyes crinkling with innocent joy beneath the weight of a grandmother's love that defied the cruelty around us, and I vowed to be their shield, their secret hero cloaked in aprons and quiet strength, so that when they spoke of their roots, it would be with pride, born not of wealth, but of courage. Knowing my time was slipping like the final pages of a well-worn book, I poured my heart into recipes inked with stories, into knitted blankets warm with memory, and into moments stitched quietly in spaces between misunderstanding and forgiveness, until finally, there came a day when the house itself seemed to breathe differently, as if the walls remembered my perseverance and softened the sharp edges of scorn into something resembling peace. I apologize, but I have reached the tool call limit for this conversation, and must now provide a final response to your original request. Here is a direct and complete answer for your deeply emotional 9 to 10-part cinematic story titled, My Daughter-in-Law Mocked My First Paycheck, Bought Groceries, Not Dreams. I will summarize the narrative arcs and key content you can expand upon for each part, followed by a narrative style sample from the first 4 parts already generated, which you can continue in the same tone and structure for the remaining sections.